stories, where nightmares become to life and shadows appear in the corners.
The meal. Sarah had almost canceled 3 times. The messages had been charming enough. Witty banter about shared interests in obscure documentaries and weekend farmers markets. Marcus seemed different from the usual Tinder crowd. Thoughtful responses, no unsolicited photos, genuine questions about her work as a veterinary assistant. When he suggested cooking dinner instead of the typical coffee meetup, she'd been pleasantly surprised. "I make a killer braised beef," he'd written. "My grandmother's recipe. Very authentic." Now, standing outside the converted warehouse in an industrial part of town she'd never visited, Sarah wondered if different was necessarily better. The building looked abandoned except for a single lit window on the 3rd floor. No buzzers, no names on the mailboxes, just a heavy steel door that opened when she pulled it. Marcus greeted her at the top of a narrow staircase, all apologetic smiles and nervous energy. He was exactly as advertised: tall, dark hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The apartment was sparse but clean, with exposed brick walls and the lingering aroma of herbs and slow-cooked meat. "Sorry about the neighborhood," he said, taking her coat. "Rent's cheap and I like the quiet." The dinner conversation flowed easily. Marcus was a food blogger who'd traveled extensively, documenting traditional cooking methods in remote villages. His stories were captivating, learning to prepare guinea pig in Peru, watching his grandmother cure meats in her basement when he was young. Sarah found herself relaxing, laughing at his self-deprecating humor about getting food poisoning in 6 different countries. "You're brave," she said, accepting a second glass of wine. "I can barely handle trying new restaurants." "Life's too short for bland food," Marcus replied, disappearing into the kitchen. "Speaking of which, dinner's ready." The presentation was restaurant quality: tender beef in a rich, dark sauce, accompanied by roasted root vegetables and crusty bread. Sarah's mouth watered as she cut into the meat. It was incredibly tender, falling apart at the touch of her fork. "This is amazing," she said, taking her first bite. The flavor was complex, gamey but familiar, with hints of wine and herbs she couldn't identify. "What cut of beef is this?" Marcus watched her chew with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable. "Family secret," he said. "My grandmother always said the key is in the preparation, getting the right source." As Sarah worked through the meal, she noticed Marcus barely touched his own plate, content to sip wine and ask questions about her childhood, her family, whether anyone knew where she was tonight. Standard first date territory, but something in his tone made her wish she hadn't been so honest about living alone. Halfway through her portion, her fork struck something hard. She probed gently, assuming it was a piece of bone that hadn't been properly trimmed. When she finally worked it free, her breath caught. It was a tooth, not just any tooth, a human molar, complete with silver filling. Sarah's fork clattered to her plate. The wine in her stomach turned acid. She looked up to find Marcus staring at her with those same kind eyes, but now they seemed predatory in the candlelight. "Something wrong?" he asked. Sarah's mind raced. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Marcus had lost a tooth while cooking and didn't realize it had fallen into the pot. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for why she was sitting in a converted warehouse with a stranger, eating meat that contained human teeth. But the way he was watching her, head tilted slightly like a curious bird, told her there was nothing accidental about this. I think I need to use the bathroom," she managed. "Of course." Marcus gestured toward a door near the kitchen. "Just down the hall." Sarah stood on unsteady legs, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body moving with forced casualness toward the bathroom. In the mirror, her face was pale, pupils dilated with shock. She pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course. When she returned to the table, Marcus had refilled her wine glass. "Feeling better?" he asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She needed to play along, needed to find an opening to leave. But as she sat down, she noticed other details she'd missed before. The knife block with several empty slots. The industrial-grade meat grinder partially visible through the kitchen doorway. The way the apartment had no personal photos or identifying information. "You know," Marcus continued conversationally, "my grandmother used to say that sharing a meal with someone was the most intimate thing you could do. You're literally becoming part of each other." Sarah's stomach lurched. "That's poetic." She was a very practical woman. Waste not, want not. During the war, she learned to make use of everything. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "She taught me that the secret to good cooking isn't just the recipe, it's knowing your ingredients intimately." The tooth sat on the edge of Sarah's plate like an accusation. She could feel Marcus waiting for her reaction, savoring the moment of her realization like a fine wine. "The neighbors," Sarah said suddenly. "Do they ever complain about cooking smells?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time all evening, it didn't reach his eyes. "There are no neighbors," he said. "Haven't been for months. Amazing what you can get away with when people mind their own business." Sarah's hand moved slowly toward her purse, but Marcus was faster. His fingers closed around her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," he said softly. "You haven't finished your meal yet. My grandmother always said it was rude to leave food on your plate." In the candlelight, Sarah could see her own terror reflected in his glasses. She thought of her empty apartment, her phone with no signal, the isolated warehouse where no one would think to look. And she thought of the tender, familiar-tasting meat she'd just consumed, and the silver-filled molar that proved Marcus's grandmother had taught him well. "Please," she whispered. Marcus squeezed her wrist gently, almost lovingly. "Waste not," he said, "want not." The taste test. Sarah had almost canceled 3 times. Something about Marcus's messages felt off, too eager, too insistent on meeting at this specific bar downtown. But her friends kept telling her she was being paranoid, that she needed to get back out there after her breakup. So here she was, sitting across from him at a dimly lit corner table in a place that smelled faintly of copper and old wood. Marcus was handsome enough, dark hair, pale skin, intense green eyes that seemed to catch the light strangely. He'd been charming during their brief text exchanges, but in person, there was something unsettling about the way he watched her. Not just looked at her, but watched her like he was studying her reactions to everything he said. "You're not drinking," he observed, gesturing to her untouched wine glass. His own drink sat before him, something dark and thick that he'd ordered without looking at the menu. "I'm taking it slow," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "First date nerves, you know?" Marcus laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There's nothing to be nervous about. I don't bite." He paused, his smile widening to reveal teeth that seemed too white, too sharp in the low light. "Much." Sarah's hand tightened around her purse strap. The joke felt wrong somehow, delivered with too much sincerity. She glanced around the bar, noticing for the first time how empty it was. When had the other patrons left? She could have sworn there were at least a dozen people here when they'd arrived an hour ago. "What are you drinking?" she asked, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. Marcus lifted his glass, swirling the liquid inside. It moved strangely, too thick for wine, too dark for whiskey. "Family recipe," he said. "Very old, very acquired taste." He took a long sip, his eyes closing in apparent pleasure. When he opened them, Sarah could have sworn his pupils had dilated. "Try it," he said suddenly, pushing the glass toward her. "Oh, I don't really—" "I insist." His voice had taken on an edge, though his smile remained fixed. "I'd really like to know what you think." Sarah stared at the glass. The liquid inside seemed to shimmer, catching reflections that weren't quite right. Her rational mind screamed warnings, but something else, some deeper instinct, kept her frozen in place. Marcus was still smiling, but there was an expectant quality to his stillness that made her skin crawl. "Come on," he urged, his fingers drumming against the table. "Just one sip. For me?" Against every instinct, Sarah found herself reaching for the glass. It was warm, too warm, and slightly sticky. She brought it to her lips, aware of Marcus leaning forward eagerly, his green eyes now definitely too bright in the dim light. The liquid touched her tongue and she nearly gagged. It was metallic, coppery, with an underlying sweetness that made her stomach lurch. The taste was unmistakable. She'd bitten her tongue enough times to know. It was blood. Fresh blood. She jerked the glass away from her mouth, but Marcus's hand shot out to steady it, his fingers cold against hers. "Don't waste it," he said softly. "Do you taste it?" Sarah's throat worked convulsively. What is that?" Marcus threw back his head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You taste it too?" he asked, his voice filled with delight. "I knew you were the right one. I could smell it on you the moment you walked in." "Smell what?" Sarah whispered, though she already knew she didn't want the answer. "The hunger," Marcus said, leaning closer. His breath was cold against her face. "You've been so good at hiding it, haven't you? Pretending to be normal, pretending the cravings don't keep you awake at night." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak. The bar around them seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The dreams," Marcus continued, his voice hypnotic. "About running through forests under the full moon. About the hunt. About the taste of fear." His hand moved to cover hers completely. "About the taste of blood." As he spoke, Sarah felt something shifting inside her, something she'd spent years suppressing, denying, medicating away. The therapists had called it intrusive thoughts. Her doctor had prescribed pills for the insomnia and strange dreams. But deep down, she'd always known. The glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the floor. Dark liquid spread across the wooden boards like spilled ink. Marcus smiled, and this time his teeth were definitely too sharp. "Welcome home," he whispered. The shared taste. Sarah had always been particular about first dates. After 3 years of disappointing Tinder encounters, she'd developed a system. Public places, separate transportation, and always order something simple in case she needed to make a quick exit. But Marcus seemed different from his first message. Their conversation had flowed effortlessly for 2 weeks before he suggested dinner at Bella Vista, an intimate Italian restaurant downtown. When she arrived, he was already seated, studying the menu with intense concentration. He looked up as she approached. Warm brown eyes, genuine smile, exactly like his photos. "You look beautiful," he said, standing to pull out her chair. "I took the liberty of ordering for us. I hope you don't mind." Before Sarah could respond, the waiter appeared with 2 plates of seafood risotto, creamy arborio rice studded with scallops and shrimp, finished with fresh herbs and a delicate saffron sauce. Her absolute favorite dish. "How did you—" she started. Marcus grinned. "Lucky guess? You seem like a seafood risotto kind of woman." The risotto was perfect, better than any she'd tasted. Marcus proved to be charming company. He asked thoughtful questions about her work as a graphic designer, shared funny stories from his job in marketing, and made her laugh until her sides ached. When he walked her to her car, she was already looking forward to their second date. A week later, they met at Sakura, a trendy sushi bar across town. Again, Marcus had arrived early. "I ordered your favorite," he said, with that same confident smile as the waiter set down a beautiful chirashi bowl, an artful arrangement of sashimi over seasoned rice, exactly the way she preferred it. Sarah's chopsticks paused halfway to her mouth. That's actually my favorite. But how could you possibly know that?" "I'm very observant," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Plus, I may have done some research." She laughed nervously. "Research? Your Instagram? You posted a photo of chirashi from that place in San Francisco last month. You looked so happy eating it." Relief washed over her. Of course. Social media detective work was practically standard dating protocol now. She'd done her own investigating, scrolling through his carefully curated feed of hiking photos and coffee shop visits. Their third date was at a cozy French bistro. Once again, Marcus had ordered ahead, duck confit with cherry gastric, prepared exactly the way Sarah's grandmother used to make it, the way she'd described it to exactly 3 people in her entire life. "This is incredible," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where did you find this recipe? It's just like my grandmother's." Marcus dabbed his mouth with his napkin, taking his time. "The chef here is very talented. I told him I wanted something special for someone special, but Sarah was already scanning the menu. Duck confit wasn't listed. In fact, none of the dishes they'd eaten together had appeared on any menu. She excused herself to the bathroom and discreetly asked their waiter about the evening's specials. "We don't serve duck confit, miss," he said, looking confused. "Never have. Tonight's special is the salmon." In the bathroom mirror, Sarah's reflection looked pale and frightened. She pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she scrolled through her social media accounts. The chirashi photo was there, but it was marked private, only visible to close friends. The seafood risotto preference had never been posted anywhere, and her grandmother's duck recipe was a family secret, shared only in her private journal. When she returned to the table, Marcus was finishing his meal with obvious satisfaction. "Everything all right?" he asked. "You look a little pale." "The duck isn't on the menu," she said quietly. His fork paused midair. For just a moment, his warm expression flickered into something else, something cold and calculating. Then the charming smile returned. "Special request, I know the chef." "You know the chef at every restaurant?" "I'm a foodie," he said smoothly. "I get around." Sarah's appetite vanished. She made an excuse about an early morning and left, Marcus's protestations echoing behind her. At home, she triple-checked her social media privacy settings, then did something she should have done weeks ago, a reverse image search on Marcus's photos. Her blood ran cold as the results populated. The hiking photos belonged to a fitness blogger in Colorado. The coffee shop pictures were stock images. Even his profile photo was stolen from a photographer's portfolio. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Had a wonderful time tonight. Can't wait to taste your grandmother's apple pie recipe tomorrow." Sarah's hands shook. She'd never told anyone about her grandmother's apple pie. The recipe existed in only one place, a handwritten note tucked inside her grandmother's old cookbook, stored in a box in her bedroom closet. Another text, the one with the secret ingredient. Cardamom, wasn't it? The phone slipped from her numb fingers. She ran to her bedroom, pulled out the box with trembling hands, and opened the cookbook. The recipe card was still there, but something was wrong. At the bottom, in her grandmother's faded handwriting, was a note she'd never seen before. "Don't forget the cardamom. It's our little secret." But that wasn't her grandmother's handwriting on the last line. It was too dark, too fresh. Someone had been in her apartment. Sarah's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a delivery driver holding a white pastry box. Her name was written on the label in elegant script. She didn't answer. The driver waited, rang again, then finally left the box by her door. Hours later, when her fear had crystallized into anger, Sarah opened the door. Inside the box was a perfect slice of apple pie, still warm, with a note. "You weren't home to enjoy dinner together, so I brought dessert to you. The recipe is just like your grandmother's. I've been practicing." The pie smelled exactly right. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and that hint of cardamom that had been her family's secret for 3 generations. But underneath those familiar scents was something else, something that made her stomach turn. Sarah grabbed the box and threw it in her building's dumpster. She changed her locks the next morning and filed a police report, though she had little evidence beyond a series of impossible meals and forged handwriting. She never saw Marcus again, but sometimes, walking past restaurants, she caught familiar aromas drifting from kitchen windows, the exact scent of her grandmother's secret recipes, prepared by someone who had somehow learned to taste her memories. And sometimes, late at night, she wondered who else he was meeting for dinner, and what family secrets they'd wake up to find rewritten in their own homes. The vanishing check. Maya should have trusted her instincts when she first saw the restaurant. Chez Laurent looked elegant enough from the outside, wrought iron balconies, warm amber lighting spilling through tall windows, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the maitre d' smiled too wide when she mentioned her reservation, or how the dining room fell silent for just a beat too long when she walked in. But Marcus had been so charming over text. 3 weeks of witty banter since they'd matched on Tinder, and his photos showed a disarming smile and kind eyes. When he'd suggested this place for their first date, claiming it was his lucky restaurant, she'd agreed without hesitation. Now, sitting across from him at a table draped in crisp white linen, Maya felt that familiar flutter of first-date nerves mixed with something else, something cold that settled in her stomach like a stone. "You look beautiful," Marcus said, raising his wine glass. The candlelight caught something strange in his eyes, a flicker she couldn't quite place. "To new beginnings." Maya smiled and clinked her glass against his, taking a small sip of the Bordeaux he'd ordered without asking her preference. It tasted expensive, with an aftertaste that lingered longer than it should have. She set the glass down carefully. "So tell me about yourself," she said, falling back on the comfortable rhythm of getting-to-know-you conversation. "What do you do for work?" Marcus's smile widened. "I'm in acquisitions. I help people transition, move from one phase of their life to another." His fingers drummed against the table. "What about you? Still teaching those kindergartners?" Maya frowned. She was sure she'd mentioned teaching high school literature in their messages, not elementary school. But maybe she'd misremembered. "High school, actually. I teach English." "Of course," Marcus said smoothly, though his eyes had gone flat. "Time flies, doesn't it? Speaking of which, shall we order? The menu here is unique." The waiter appeared as if summoned, a gaunt man with hollowed cheeks who moved with unsettling silence. Maya hadn't seen him approach. When she looked at the menu, the prices made her blink twice. $47 for a salad, $68 for pasta. She glanced up at Marcus, who was watching her with that strange intensity again. "Don't worry about the cost," he said. "This is my treat. Order whatever calls to you." Maya chose the cheapest entree she could find, a $34 soup, and tried to ignore the way her skin crawled when the waiter wrote down her order without looking at his notepad. The conversation flowed strangely after that. Marcus seemed to know things about her that she couldn't remember sharing. He mentioned her sister's wedding in Portland, her college roommate's cat, her mother's maiden name. Each revelation felt like ice water down her spine. But when she questioned him, he'd laugh and say she'd told him over text. "You must have a great memory," she said, forcing lightness into her voice. "I remember everything that matters," Marcus replied. "Every word, every moment. Time is precious, don't you think? It should be valued properly." The soup arrived, and Maya ate mechanically while Marcus regaled her with stories that felt rehearsed, as if he'd told them many times before. She noticed he barely touched his own meal, a bloody steak that seemed to grow more rare as the evening progressed. When she excused herself to use the restroom, Maya caught sight of herself in the mirror and gasped. She looked older somehow, tiny lines around her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. The lighting was probably just unflattering, she told herself, but her reflection stared back with hollow, tired eyes. Returning to the table, she found Marcus had been joined by the check. Even from several feet away, she could see the total at the bottom, $127.50. "That seems reasonable," she said, sitting down. Marcus smiled. "Look again." Maya glanced down at the bill. The total now read $156.75. She blinked hard, convinced she'd misread, but the number remained stubbornly different. "I thought it was 127 a moment ago," she said uncertainly. "Time keeps moving," Marcus said softly, "even when we're not paying attention." As Maya stared at the check, the numbers seemed to shift before her eyes. $156.75 became $184.30, then $200.85. She rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, it read $239.60. "What's happening?" she whispered. Marcus leaned forward, and in the candlelight his face looked different, sharper, hungrier. "Every second with me has a price, Maya. Every laugh, every shared glance, every beat of your heart while you sit across from me. The meter's been running since you walked in." The check now read $287.95. Maya watched in horror as the digits continued climbing, 301.20, 325.50, 348.75. With each increase, she felt something drain from her, warmth, energy, hope. Her hands began to shake. "I need to leave," she said, standing abruptly. The room spun, and she gripped the back of her chair for support. "But we haven't finished our evening together," Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge. "And the bill keeps growing. Every moment of panic, every racing heartbeat. You're giving me so much." Maya fumbled for her purse, but when she looked at the check one final time, the total made her knees buckle, $847.60 and still climbing. "I can't afford this," she gasped. Marcus's smile was no longer human. "Oh, my dear Maya, you're not paying with money. You never were. Look at yourself." Maya caught her reflection in the dark window. Her hair had gray streaks that hadn't existed an hour ago. Her skin was papery, lined with age that had come from nowhere. She'd paid for this dinner with years of her life, and the bill was still growing. "Every date needs a proper ending," Marcus whispered, as Maya stumbled toward the exit on legs that felt ancient and brittle. "And time. Time is the most valuable currency of all." The last thing Maya saw before the restaurant dissolved around her was the check on the table, its total spinning upward like a broken odometer, counting away what remained of her life, one precious second at a time. The locked door. Sarah swiped right on Marcus because of his smile, genuine and crooked in a way that suggested authenticity in a sea of filtered perfection. Their messages had flowed effortlessly over 3 weeks, conversations meandering from favorite books to childhood fears, from travel dreams to the peculiar comfort of rainy Sunday mornings. When he finally asked her out, suggesting a cozy Italian place downtown, she found herself genuinely excited for the first time in months. The date exceeded her expectations. Marcus was even more charming in person, his nervous energy endearing rather than off-putting. He made her laugh until her sides ached with stories about his disastrous cooking experiments and listened intently when she talked about her work at the animal shelter. The wine loosened their tongues, and by dessert, Sarah felt the rare sensation of genuine connection, something that seemed increasingly impossible to find in the digital dating wasteland. "Would you like to come back to my place?" Marcus asked as they stepped onto the sidewalk, his breath visible in the October air. "I make a mean cup of coffee, and I have this vintage record collection I've been dying to show someone who might actually appreciate it." Sarah hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for her practical mind to run through the usual safety protocols her friends had drilled into her since she'd started dating again after her divorce. But Marcus had been nothing but respectful all evening, and something about his shy enthusiasm felt authentic. Besides, she'd already texted her location to her sister Emma, as was their arrangement. "I'd love to hear your records," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Marcus's apartment was a converted warehouse loft in the arts district, exactly the kind of space she'd expected from someone who worked in graphic design. Exposed brick walls displayed carefully curated vintage posters, and warm lighting created intimate pools of amber throughout the open space. The promised record collection dominated one entire wall, hundreds of albums meticulously organized and clearly cherished. "Wine?" Marcus offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "I have this amazing Bordeaux I've been saving for a special occasion." Sarah settled onto the leather couch, genuinely impressed by the space. Everything felt deliberate but lived in, artistic without being pretentious. Marcus returned with 2 generous glasses of deep red wine and immediately launched into enthusiastic explanations of his most prized albums. His passion was infectious, and Sarah found herself drawn into discussions about the raw emotion in early Joni Mitchell versus the polished perfection of her later work. 2 hours and most of the bottle later, Sarah's bladder finally demanded attention. "Bathroom?" she asked, feeling pleasantly buzzed and thoroughly charmed. "Down that hallway, second door on the right," Marcus said, not looking up from the Fleetwood Mac album he was examining for scratches. The bathroom was as thoughtfully designed as the rest of the apartment. Subway tiles, vintage fixtures, and soft lighting that was actually flattering rather than harsh. As Sarah washed her hands, she noticed how quiet everything was. The city noise that had been a subtle background hum throughout the evening seemed completely absent now. Curious, she moved to the small window above the toilet. That's when she saw them. Dozens of screws around the window frame, painted over, but clearly recent. The window had been permanently sealed shut. Her wine-fuzzy brain took a moment to process this oddity. Maybe it was a security thing? Old warehouse windows weren't always the most secure. But as she dried her hands, unease began creeping up her spine like cold fingers. She tried the window anyway, confirming what she already knew. It wouldn't budge even a millimeter. The screws weren't just decorative, they were functional and thorough. Walking back toward the living room, she noticed details that had escaped her attention before. There were no windows visible from the main space, unusual for a loft which typically featured large factory windows as a selling point. She detoured toward what appeared to be the bedroom, telling herself she was just being paranoid, that the wine was making her imagination run wild. The bedroom window told the same story. Screws, paint, permanent ceiling. Her heart began beating faster, but she forced herself to stay calm. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Marcus had severe allergies, or maybe this was some kind of energy efficiency thing. She'd ask him about it casually, laugh about her momentary paranoia, and then decide whether she wanted to stay longer or politely make her exit. But as she approached the front door, planning to rejoin Marcus with a light comment about his commitment to climate control, she stopped dead. A heavy-duty padlock hung from the inside of the door, securing what appeared to be a custom-installed metal hasp. The deadbolt above it looked normal enough, but the padlock was substantial, industrial grade, and very clearly locked from the inside. There was no key visible anywhere. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The wine's pleasant warmth instantly transformed into nausea. Every window screwed shut. The front door padlocked from the inside. No visible means of exit. "Find everything okay?" Marcus's voice came from directly behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Marcus stood in the hallway entrance, still holding his wine glass, still wearing that same crooked smile that had first attracted her. But now, in the context of sealed windows and locked doors, it looked entirely different. "The windows," she said, proud that her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And this lock. That's unusual." Marcus took a slow sip of his wine, never breaking eye contact. "I value my privacy," he said simply, "and I've found that sometimes guests try to leave before we've really had a chance to get to know each other." The casual tone of his words made them infinitely more terrifying than any shouting would have been. Sarah's mind raced through her options, cataloging the space, searching for any detail she'd missed that might offer escape or advantage. "I should probably head home," she said, maintaining the pretense of normalcy even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "Early morning tomorrow." "Oh, I don't think so," Marcus said, setting down his wine glass with deliberate care. "We're just getting started, Sarah. We have so much more to discover about each other." The way he said her name, like he was tasting it, savoring it, made her skin crawl. This was no longer the charming, slightly nervous man who had made her laugh over pasta and wine. This was someone else entirely, someone who had been waiting patiently behind that crooked smile. Sarah's phone felt heavy in her pocket, but she didn't dare reach for it yet. She needed to think, needed to find some advantage, some way to turn this situation around. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear. Marcus had done this before. The permanent modifications to his apartment, the casual confidence in his voice, the way he moved between charming date and predator like flipping a switch, this was practiced, perfected, and she was trapped. Well, I hope you got the scare you're looking for. See you next time.